With machine guns, tanks, and nuclear bombs, the combat in World War II was absolutely brutal. But one soldier served on the front lines without a gun, charging into battle with the goal of saving lives rather than taking them. Meet Desmond Doss, an American war hero who's known for saving hundreds of soldiers, kicking away grenades, earning the Medal of Honor, and going down in history as the soldier who fought a war without a weapon. World War II was the most vicious conflict in human history with an estimated 70 to 85 million fatalities. But Desmond Doss was one of the few soldiers on the front lines who didn't try and contribute to this number, as he fought the entire war completely unarmed. Despite this, he's known as one of America's greatest war heroes, and the miracle he performed at Hacksaw Ridge in Japan has been heralded as one of the most incredible stories in military history. But before we get to that, to understand why he refused to carry a weapon, we have to go back to his upbringing in the city of Lynchburg, Virginia. Desmond was born on February 7, 1919, and he was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist. This is a small Christian denomination with some strict rules, including no smoking or drinking, total pacifism, and taking a weekly day of rest and worship called Sabbath on Saturdays instead of Sundays. They also believe that the second coming of Christ is imminent, which means that we're rapidly approaching the end of the world, when Jesus will return to earth and take all the righteous dead up to heaven. It's a pretty niche denomination, and when Doss was born, there were just 170,000 other Seventh-day Adventists in the world. But this religious background impacted him greatly. When he was a kid, he scraped his knee on a rock and developed blood poisoning. The doctor thought his leg would need to be amputated, but Desmond's mother, Bertha, put hot towels over the wound and prayed for God to heal her son. And incredibly, he made a full recovery without surgery. Doss felt the prayer saved his life, which cemented his unwavering faith in God as he grew up. His family owned this picture that depicted the 10 Commandments, and little Desmond's favorite was "Thou shalt not kill." His family said he was shocked that anyone could hurt another living being, and he was a firm believer in pacifism from a young age. He even went vegetarian in his teenage years, and in a time before veggie burgers and halloumi fries, that was a big deal. On one instance, his father got in a fight with his uncle and drew a gun to threaten him. The cops were called, and his dad gave Desmond the gun and told him to hide it. Well, Des did as he was asked, and his father was arrested, but he truly believed his dad was going to take his own brother's life if the cops didn't arrive in time, so he vowed to never touch a gun again. So Des grew up into a pretty upstanding guy who was very anti-violence. But when he turned 18 in 1937, he had to register for the draft like everybody else. See, for those of you who aren't from the States, when the U.S. joined World War I in 1917, the government introduced something called the Selective Service Act. This law requires every male U.S. citizen to register with the Selective Service system when they turn 18, so if America ever goes to war and needs to perform a draft, they have a database of everyone that they can conscript. The SSS has existed ever since, and in 1937 it was Doss's turn to register. But he had promised to never use a gun or harm another human being, so he signed up as a conscientious objector, which is someone who refuses to fight in a war for moral or religious reasons. If a draft occurs, some objectors refuse to serve in the military at all, which is illegal and can result in jail time. But others like Doss are specifically against violence and have no problem serving their country in nonviolent ways. The U.S. typically respects this by giving them civilian roles back at home like agricultural work, forestry, and manufacturing. Now I know what you're thinking. Didn't Desmond serve on the front lines in the Pacific Theater? Yep, despite being a conscientious objector, Des stormed beaches and dodged gunfire just like his fellow soldiers. And here's why. Unfortunately, not everyone is as peaceful as Desmond, and in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and sparked the outbreak of history's most devastating conflict, World War II. As the Allied and Axis powers started declaring war on each other, the U.S. initially grabbed some popcorn and stayed out of it. But in 1940, they realized that they might have to join the fight eventually, so they began to conduct a draft conscripting men from the Selective Service system to start their military training. This turned out to be a good call because on December 7, 1941, the Axis-aligned Japanese military attacked a U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, taking 2,400 lives. The attack was a response to oil sanctions that the U.S. had placed on Japan after they invaded China, and they hoped that it would intimidate the American government and force them into negotiations. But it kind of backfired, as the U.S. actually responded by declaring war on Axis and joining World War II. At this point, Desmond was working at the Newport News shipyards in Virginia as a joiner, which involves creating and installing the floors, ceilings, and furnishings inside a ship. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. increased their conscription rates, but shipbuilding was an important part of the war effort, so Doss was offered the opportunity to stay home and work as a joiner for the duration of the war. However, he was disgusted by the Axis powers' beliefs and their actions in Europe and Pearl Harbor, so despite being a conscientious objector, he wanted to serve his country on the front lines and do everything he could to protect freedom. This meant that in April 1942, the pacifist voluntarily enlisted for the Army and shipped out for training as a combat medic. He was first sent to Camp Lee in Virginia, where it soon became clear that he was very different from the other soldiers. Doss strictly adhered to his Adventist beliefs, refusing to bear arms and devoting every Saturday to prayer and worship. The Army legally had to respect these religious practices, so while Doss underwent basic training like all the other men, he was allowed to skip weapons training entirely. Many soldiers resented this, calling him a coward for refusing to use a gun and accusing him of using religion as an excuse to shirk off his Saturday duties. This led to ridicule, and he had shoes thrown at him whilst he prayed. One soldier even threatened him, telling Doss, "If you go into combat, I'm gonna shoot you." Despite this bullying, Desmond didn't quit, and after passing basic, he was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and assigned to Company Bravo of the 307th Regiment of the 77th Division. Initially, the Army refused his request to be a medic and assigned him as a rifleman. During one exercise, Desmond's captain asked him to take hold of a rifle, but he refused, letting the gun fall to the ground. The captain gave him another chance, trying and failing to convince him to handle a pistol, then finally a trench knife. Doss refused to bear arms in all forms, so eventually the Army relented and allowed him to start his training as a medic. During World War II, this role essentially involved treating minor injuries on the battlefield and carrying seriously wounded soldiers out of combat on stretchers to reach aid stations behind the front line. This job was particularly dangerous as it required medics to run into battle with minimal protection. In 1929, the Geneva Convention did make it a war crime to intentionally attack medics during a battle, but during World War II, the Japanese military would often disregard this and specifically target medics to demoralize the enemy. So in the Pacific Theater, lots of medics carried guns to protect themselves and removed any symbols on their uniform that would identify them. Still, Desmond wasn't put off by the danger. He continued his medic training while using a pass to leave camp every Saturday and attend church with his new wife Dorothy. However, this didn't sit right with the top brass, and his sergeant and captain grew increasingly annoyed with his constant absences and refusal to carry a gun. Eventually, they reached their breaking point and told Doss that he was being discharged from the Army on grounds of mental instability. Desmond was pretty offended by this, so he challenged the decision in front of a committee of 5 medical officers and the battalion commander. Desmond said that his religious beliefs weren't evidence of mental illness, and he refused to leave. The committee knew that if they pressed the issue, they'd get in trouble for trying to discharge a soldier for his religious views. So Doss was allowed to stay, and after 2 long years of preparation, the 77th Division was finishing up their training and getting ready to be shipped out to the Pacific. Here, Desmond would prove the naysayers wrong and secure his legacy as one of the bravest soldiers of World War II. But first, he had to charge into his very first battle in Guam, a Pacific island that was occupied by Japan. The 77th first saw combat in July 1944 as they were tasked with storming Guam's west coast at Agat Bay. However, they had no amphibious vehicles, so they were forced to hop off their boats in waist-high water and wade onto the island under heavy Japanese fire. This was terrifying, but Doss stayed true to his beliefs, charging into battle with nothing but a medical bag and his trusty Bible. He quickly came face to face with the horrors of war, tragically suffering the loss of 2 friends in his regiment. Yet this didn't stop him from helping everyone he could during the battle, including the enemy. See, after a skirmish, some wounded Japanese soldiers were found treated with American bandages. Doss later admitted that when he found a severely injured enemy on the battlefield, he still tried to treat their wounds, as it was in his nature to help anyone who was suffering and in pain. However, he stopped to practice when a group of American troops pointed their guns at him and threatened to shoot if he didn't stop. Doss continued to treat Americans, and after a few weeks of fighting, they'd successfully pushed into Guam and captured it. The 77th had won their first battle, but Doss didn't have much time to rest because the division soon left Guam to help with the invasion of another Japanese-occupied island in the Philippines called Leyte. Here, Doss saw brutal combat and continued to care for his comrades, at times showing almost no concern for his own safety. On one occasion, his unit were moving through the island when they were pinned down by a sniper. One of the men was hit and left lying out in the open, but Doss's officers warned him not to help the soldier as he would be left completely unprotected. Doss refused to leave the man behind, so he ran into the open battlefield to reach him. He tended to his wounds and put him on a combat stretcher called a litter before dragging him to a nearby aid station under enemy fire. When he got there, his sergeant was amazed that Desmond was still alive, explaining that although he couldn't get a shot on the sniper, he'd seen the sharpshooter aim his gun directly at Doss. Nobody knew why the sniper never fired, but of course Doss believed that it was because the Lord was looking out for him, just like the blood poisoning incident in his youth. Either way, whether it was a higher power or plain old luck, Doss survived the Battle of Leyte. Furthermore, when the island was taken in early 1945, he was awarded 2 Bronze Stars for his bravery in the battle and his actions on Guam. This is the 4th highest award for heroism in combat a soldier can receive, so Doss was finally garnering respect in the Army. But his job wasn't done, and the 77th's final and most dangerous stop in the Pacific was about 930 miles away from Leyte in Okinawa, Japan. This island sits around 1,000 miles from Tokyo, and it became the site of Desmond's biggest test and most incredible act of bravery. See, when the 77th arrived in March 1945, taking Okinawa was incredibly important for the Allies. It was the last barrier blocking them from mainland Japan, so if they controlled Okinawa, they could use it as an airbase to perform bombing runs on the mainland and block off Japanese supply boats bringing resources to the country. Furthermore, by this point, Germany were about to surrender, and Europe and Japan was the only Axis country still fighting hard for victory. So taking Okinawa was a clear step in ending the war for good. Indeed, the Battle of Okinawa did end up being the last major battle of World War II, but it was also one of the deadliest. And the 183,000 American soldiers traveling to the island alongside Doss had no idea what they were in for. The 77th Division were the first American soldiers to land ashore, and they started the attack by taking several smaller islands off Okinawa's west coast. By this point, the Japanese soldiers were growing desperate, so the fighting was brutal. On Lejima Island, Doss and his fellow soldiers came up against kamikaze attacks from planes and local women who'd been armed with spears, as the Japanese made last-ditch attempts to protect their territory. But by the end of April, these islands were secured, and the Americans used them to stage an invasion of Okinawa, landing in amphibious vehicles and fighting their way inland. Once on shore, the 77th were part of a force who traveled south towards the city of Shuri. They faced fierce resistance from Japanese troops hiding in the island's dense vegetation, caves, and rocky terrain. They experienced thousands of casualties, but they knew that these were just outposts, and they hadn't even reached Shuri's main defenses yet. But that soon changed when the 77th continued traveling south and encountered a towering 400-foot cliff called the Maeda Escarpment. The top held the ruins of Uraso Castle, a structure that was used by the Japanese as a strong defensive position due to its elevation and network of caves and tunnels under the surface. The Americans coming from the north knew that they'd have to get past the cliff to progress further into the island toward Shuri, but it wasn't going to be an easy feat. The U.S. plan of attack was to continuously climb the escarpment, have a brief skirmish, then retreat to safety at the bottom of the cliff. To do this, the soldiers would have to climb 360 feet up the steep cliffside, scrambling up a near vertical incline for the last 35 feet. To make this easier, Desmond and 2 other men volunteered to claw their way up to the cliff first and tie some cargo nets to the top to create a ladder for the last stretch of the climb. With the nets in place, the Americans were ready, and the battle for the escarpment began on April 26, 1945. The first regiment to climb the netting was the 381st Infantry, and as they reached the top, they found that the Japanese soldiers had set up some incredibly strong defenses. They were hidden in camouflage trenches, foxholes, and caves with their guns trained to the cliff's edge. So as the 381st pulled themselves over the top, they were met with a wave of bullets from guns that appeared to be sticking out of the ground. It was a disaster, and the entire U.S. force had to retreat back down the cliff to safety. They dubbed the escarpment Hacksaw Ridge due to the cutting line of bullets waiting at the top of the cliff. But despite this, the command stuck with their plan and continued to send waves of men up the escarpment. Over the next few days, the 381st lost 536 soldiers, so it's fair to say that the attack wasn't going well. But on April 29th, the 307th Regiment was ordered to replace the 381st, meaning that it was now Desmond's turn to face Hacksaw Ridge. As his regiment prepared to ascend the cliff, Doss decided to pray for Bravo Company's safety. The soldiers who'd mocked him in training knew they were facing a barrage of bullets, so they paused and listened to his prayer before starting their climb. Alpha Company reached the top first further down the escarpment, and they were gunned down almost immediately. So Doss and the rest of Bravo Company were told to take the hilltop on their own. As they scrambled over the top, they were initially pinned down by heavy gunfire, but against all odds, they managed to put up a fight and take out 8 or 9 enemy pillboxes before retreating back down the cliff. As they scrambled down to safety, they realized that despite the strength of the Japanese defenses, nobody from Bravo Company had died. Furthermore, only one man was injured from a rock that had fallen onto his hand during the climb. When the higher-ups caught wind of the story, they asked the soldiers how they'd managed to pull off such a feat, and the men said that they believed Doss's prayer was responsible for their survival. But the battle wasn't over, and Doss's greatest miracle was yet to come. A few days later, on Saturday, May 5th, Doss's regiment was ordered to climb the escarpment again. The 155 men in Bravo Company prepared to ascend the cliff, but first, as it was Desmond's Sabbath, they waited for him to read his Bible and say a prayer. Once he was ready, the men scaled the escarpment, but this time things immediately started going wrong. The 307th attempted to break up the Japanese line by throwing bundles of TNT into their foxholes and trenches. However, the Japanese troops were able to quickly grab the explosives and remove the fuses before they blew up. The Americans responded by throwing 5-gallon cans of gasoline into the enemy foxholes instead. Then a lieutenant threw a white phosphorus grenade in after them to ignite the fuel and start a fire. However, to the troops' surprise, the foxholes erupted in a huge explosion as the gasoline, defused TNT, and a cache of buried Japanese ammunition was ignited. The unexpectedly large explosion blew up troops on both sides, but the Japanese soldiers seized their opportunity by fixing their bayonets and charging out of their trenches at the American line. Bravo Company was outgunned and outmanned, and they realized that staying on the escarpment would mean certain death. So a full retreat was ordered as the Americans turned and fled back to the cliff edge. But as the men started climbing down the rocks, Desmond looked back and realized that wounded Americans were still scattered around the top of the hill. As we know from his actions in Guam and Leyte, Desmond never left a man behind. So in an unbelievable act of bravery, he decided to stay on the escarpment and sneak past the Japanese troops to save as many soldiers as he could. He started by placing the nearest man on a litter and dragging him to the edge of the cliff. Then he grabbed a nearby rope and used it to lower the stretcher 35 feet to the bottom of the cargo net. He shouted down to the soldiers at the bottom to take the injured man to the closest aid station before turning around and sprinting back into the battlefield. He soon reached another wounded soldier and dragged him to the cliff edge. This time he didn't have a litter, so he used the rope to tie a double bowline knot around the man's legs before looping the other end around a nearby tree stump. He then lowered the man down the ridge before reeling the rope back in and heading out to look for another person to save. As Japanese soldiers searched for survivors of the attack, Doss snuck around the battlefield for hours, quietly dragging injured soldiers to the cliff and lowering them to safety. As we know, Japanese soldiers would specifically target medics, and Doss didn't have a gun, so if he was caught, it would mean certain death. He later said that he got so close to the enemy that at times he could hear them whispering to each other. But he continued his mission as night fell, and after each rescue he'd give a quick prayer saying, "Lord, help me get one more." He had several close calls, and after the war, a Japanese soldier said that he'd actually had Doss in his sights on the escarpment. but when he tried to shoot him, his gun kept jamming. There's no way to confirm this, but after 5 hours, Doss had single-handedly saved almost every wounded man on the hill without getting shot, before finally lowering the last soldier and climbing down to safety. The rest of Bravo Company couldn't believe what they were seeing, and as Doss reached the ground, he was covered in blood and surrounded by flies, but completely uninjured. Still, he was pretty far from okay. His strict vegetarian diet meant he had a thin 145 pounds frame, as most of the rations at the time consisted of bacon with beans or cheese. So Doss's diet of coconuts and biscuits made him weak, and his fellow soldiers couldn't believe he'd found the strength to lower so many heavier men down the cliff face continuously for 5 hours. The soldiers who'd bullied him back at boot camp held Desmond as a hero, and as word got around, a general from the 77th Division headquarters came to the camp to meet him. However, Desmond didn't want praise. He just wanted to pray, and he explained he was too busy giving thanks to God to talk to the general. Despite this, the general recommended that Desmond should receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions, which is the highest award in the entire American military. The Army calculated that Doss saved over 100 soldiers on the escarpment, but Desmond maintained it couldn't have been more than 50. So they settled on 75 as the official number in his Medal of Honor citation. Regardless of the number, his actions boosted his fellow soldiers' morale, and the very next day they stormed the cliff for the final time and successfully beat back the Japanese defenses. The Americans had taken Hacksaw Ridge, but they still had work to do, and once Doss was cleared by the other medics, he was required to go back into battle. 2 weeks later, the 77th had advanced around half a mile past Hacksaw Ridge, finally reaching Shuri. But on the night of May 21st, Desmond's regiment accidentally walked straight into a company of Japanese soldiers, resulting in some frantic gunfighting and hand-to-hand combat. The Americans ran for cover, but Desmond courageously stayed in open ground to drag wounded soldiers to safety. He ran over to 3 soldiers when he saw the enemy throwing a grenade at them. He didn't have time to pause and think, so to protect them, he kicked the grenade out of the air. It exploded almost immediately and blew Desmond away, and when he landed, he found his leg was bleeding heavily. Unfortunately, Desmond was the only medic around and he didn't have a stretcher, so he was forced to treat his own injuries and wait as the battle roared on around him for 5 hours. Eventually, other medics arrived with a litter, but by this point, Doss and his fellow soldiers were under attack from a Japanese tank, and there was another critically injured soldier nearby. The medics got to Desmond and lifted him onto the stretcher, but he rolled off and told them to save the other man first. Now, Doss obviously couldn't face down a tank with his trusty rope and medic bag, especially with a bum leg. So some other soldiers helped him to retreat from the tank, and they soon found an empty foxhole that they could use to bed down for the night. It was a tight squeeze, so Desmond dug the hole wider so all the men could fit inside. They slept safely, but the next day they found that he'd dug within inches of an unexploded artillery shell, which would have blown them all up. That morning, a soldier agreed to help Doss get to the closest aid station, but as they were setting out together, Desmond's luck finally ran out as he was shot by a Japanese sniper. The bullet lodged in his upper arm, shattering the bone entirely. However, it was later noted that if the bullet hadn't hit him, the angle of the shot meant it would have taken the other soldier's life. So Desmond had inadvertently saved yet another American. His companion was incredibly surprised when the injured Doss asked if he could have his rifle. Had Desmond finally reached his breaking point, and was the Adventist about to go on a Rambo-style rampage against the Japanese soldiers? Of course not. Desmond simply put the gun against his wounded arm and tied it in place with his jacket, creating a makeshift splint. The men were still being targeted by the sniper, so they crawled for 300 yards across the open battlefield to reach the American line. Despite his injuries, Desmond made it, finally reaching the safety of an aid station. Doss was severely wounded, so the medics organized for him to be transported to Okinawa's coast and put on a hospital ship called the USS Mercy for proper treatment. He was safe, but because he'd been separated from the rest of the 77th Division, they had no idea where he was. In fact, when the 77th medics who'd initially tried to save Doss from the tank came back for him, he was nowhere to be found, so they assumed he had died. This led to a KIA report, which was eventually printed in newspapers back in Lynchburg. But thankfully, Doss soon wrote to his mother from the USS Mercy, allowing him to explain the situation and reassure that he was still alive. Against all odds, he'd escaped from Okinawa with his life, And for Desmond, the war was over as he was sent back home to recover from his injuries. He received surgery to remove 17 pieces of shrapnel from his leg, and his injured arm was set in a cast. Meanwhile, the Battle of Okinawa raged on until the U.S. finally took the island in June 1945. Today, it's considered the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific Theater, with over 110,000 Japanese casualties and 49,000 U.S. casualties. But of course, that number would have been even higher if Doss hadn't rescued so many soldiers. After Okinawa was taken, the U.S. didn't invade mainland Japan after all. Instead, in August 1945, they dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, taking an estimated 246,000 lives and forcing Japanese surrender. World War II was over and Desmond had successfully survived the conflict without firing a single shot. Back in the States, he was a hero, receiving 3 Purple Hearts and a promotion to the rank of corporal, which made him the highest-ranking conscientious objector in history. Furthermore, on October 12, 1945, he accepted the Medal of Honor from President Truman on the White House lawn, becoming the first objector to ever receive the award. The medal is specifically given for acts of valor in the face of the enemy, and Desmond's bravery at Hacksaw Ridge soon became well known throughout the U.S. For the rest of his life, he'd attend church services, rallies, and speaking events celebrating his valor in the war, and in 1990, a highway in Georgia was even named after him. But unfortunately, his life as a civilian wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. His service left him with a litany of health issues, and in 1946, he found out that he'd contracted tuberculosis while serving in Leyte. Doctors told him that even with surgery, his chances of survival were 50-50, so he soon had an operation to remove his left lung and 5 ribs. He spent 5 years recovering and eventually pulled through, dodging death yet again. But antibiotics were quite experimental at the time, and the medication he took for his TB caused him to go deaf in 1976. Now, Doss is one tough cookie, and he received a cochlear implant to restore some of his hearing and went on to live a happy life, but even he couldn't live forever. And in 2006, he passed away from a respiratory illness in Alabama at the ripe old age of 87. His story didn't die with him, though, and countless books and documentaries have been made about the miracle in Okinawa. In 2016, his story was even made into a blockbuster movie called Hacksaw Ridge, where he was played by Andrew Garfield. Incredibly, the director Mel Gibson omitted parts of Desmond's story as he thought they would seem too far-fetched to the audience. He left out the entire incident where Doss gave up his stretcher for another soldier before being shot by a sniper, believing it was too noble even for a character in a movie. So Desmond's actions were literally unbelievably brave, and he'll go down as one of America's most incredible war heroes. Who else could take on World War II without a weapon and walk away with a Medal of Honor? What part of Desmond's story was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're here, check out some of my other videos on wild war stories. See you next time.